It looks like we'll finally get this USMCA done. Is there a sense of relief in Mexico? Is there a sense of almost resentment? Why did it take us so long?
Well, I think your first characterization is probably more accurate. Rather than celebrate it, there was more of a sense of relief after a couple of years of negotiation, a lot of anxiety, the occasional threat on tariffs as related to immigration and border security, and then that little hiccup at the end with respect to the labor provisions. But I would say generally it's been well received. It's an agreement that there are a lot of winners and losers, and perhaps not an additional or a next generation step in the direction of free trade, but it preserves a North American platform for production. And I think Canadians, Mexicans, and people all across the U.S. Should be pleased that it seems to be headed towards ratification the early part of 2020.
Yeah, Mr. Investor, you make a really important distinction. I was going to ask, with ratification, assuming it happens with USMCA, does that make the economic life better in Mexico, or does it just not make it worse?
Well, I think it actually, that's a good question. I think it's better in the sense that you have an agreement. It'll bring a certain level of certainty to investors. As one friend of mine in Texas said, he says, listen, Tony, let's not criticize a dog for not dancing well. Let's applaud it for dancing at all. And so the fact that we've got an agreement, I think, is a step forward in terms of preserving an environment that has functioned very well for investors. And created, thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs in three countries, that we preserve that platform. So I say a net positive, to be sure.
We're talking with Antonio Garza. He's former U.S. ambassador in Mexico. Put this in the context, if you would, Mr. Ambassador, of the larger Mexican economy and how specifically President Lopez Obrador is doing right now down there. As I understand, there's a little bit of an uneasy relationship with the private sector. Is that fair?
Well, I think that's a fair assessment, David, and a very nuanced sense of what's going on. If you look at the first year or so of President Lopez Obrador's presidency, you'd have to give him generally good marks on macro stability. The peso has stood firm. Generally, I think his stewardship of the macro economy of the country has been well received. Bringing USMCA or TMEC to completion for an individual that was never characterized as a free trader or a committed free trader, to stay hitched to that was well received. And thirdly, the way they've managed the bilateral relationship. But I think it's important to note that from the perspective of the economy generally, there's simply been no growth. And while USMCA, I think, is a welcome relief to larger investors, multinationals, and larger Mexican business community, what I'm starting to hear is concern amongst the smaller and mid-sized businesses about the consolidation of power that has been attendant to this administration's tenure, and the undermining of institutions with respect to human rights or the Electoral Commission, and even the courts. So if you look at foreign direct investment for 2018, curiously, it was actually up for foreign direct investment, but Mexican investment was way down. And I think perhaps they're seeing things or concerned about things like that lack of growth, security, violence, and this administration's when they've involved themselves in the economy. For example, the suspension of the airport contract at the start of the administration, that was a blow. And then later hitting pause on energy reform. I think within the country, there's still some concerns as to how committed to investment and economic growth this administration is.